I knew something was off the moment I saw a police cruiser idle at the entrance of our cul-de-sac, positioned like a prop in a low-budget courtroom drama. The engine rumbled, the radio crackled, and then the back door opened with the slow, theatrical suspense of a stage curtain rising. And there she was, Karen. Fresh out of jail, hair frizzed into a halo of chaos, sunglasses too big for her face, jaw clenched tight enough to snap a fence post. She scanned the neighborhood like she expected a red carpet. Instead, she locked eyes with me, standing next to my truck, holding my coffee as if this was just another regular morning. I did not wave, because some moments are sacred, and the first glimpse of your former HOA tyrant stumbling back into sunlight after 6 weeks behind bars is one of them. She froze like she needed a second to recalculate the existence of a world in which I still lived here. I sipped my coffee, because if dramatic tension had calories, this moment could have fed the entire county. She stepped toward me with the stiff, self-important posture she used to weaponize during HOA board meetings, though prison time had stripped away the false politeness she used to coat her cruelty with. Now she walked like someone who believed she had been wronged by the entire universe. She stopped a few feet from me, breathing hard, as if I had personally orchestrated her downfall. I wanted to remind her that the only thing I ever orchestrated was the very legal exposure of her cooking the HOA books and forcing residents to pay invented fees. But I waited, partly because I was curious about her new strategy and partly because bait never jumps first. She opened her mouth like she was about to start a monologue, but a slight twitch in her jaw told me she was struggling to decide which version of herself she should resurrect. The smug queen of fines and citations, or the victim of a grand conspiracy she still believed I masterminded. In truth, all I did was send the state auditor copies of her own spreadsheets and let math do the talking. But in Karen's head, betrayal and arithmetic were identical crimes. So she just stared at me, then stared at the tidy houses around us, then back at me. She wanted a fight. She needed a fight. But she also knew she couldn't start one while a police cruiser was still present. She swallowed whatever insult she had chambered and marched away like a silent film villain storming off stage. I watched her stomp through the neighborhood, noting every cosmetic change since her sudden disappearance. New shrubs, repainted mailbox posts, a park bench finally repaired. A neighborhood that had breathed a long, deep sigh of relief. The HOA board she used to dominate had collapsed after her arrest, leaving a vacuum that required someone calm, competent, and willing to untangle the mess she left behind. Normally that would not describe me. But after watching neighbors suffer under her petty rule, I volunteered. A quiet, almost bored willingness to take on the responsibility won over the room. They handed me the HOA presidency with the kind of desperate gratitude usually reserved for firefighters rescuing kittens. And it turned out I was surprisingly good at it. Simple, transparent rules. A budget that actually made sense. Maintenance requests handled in days, not months. And best of all, no more fines for the crime of existing slightly outside Karen's definition of proper. The neighborhood healed. People laughed outside again. Kids chalked drawings on sidewalks without fear of citations referencing pavement purity regulations she personally invented. We had moved forward, but Karen arriving like a vengeful apparition meant she planned to drag us backward. Later that afternoon, I found her standing in the middle of the cul-de-sac like a general preparing to recapture lost territory. A clipboard hung from her arm, the same battered one she used during her reign. The sight alone caused a couple walking their dog to turn around and head home. I approached slowly, not wanting to spook her into issuing imaginary infractions. She clicked her pen, ready to write something down, then glared at me with a look that probably intimidated people before she got arrested for fraud. I asked if she needed help, though my tone made it clear the answer I hoped for was no. She said she was resuming her position as HOA president and would need immediate access to the office, the files, and the emergency funds she claimed we mishandled. I didn't laugh, because laughter makes people defensive. Instead, I asked if she had read any bylaws lately. She snapped that bylaws were irrelevant because she wrote half of them. This was partially true, although most of her additions had since been removed for obvious reasons like legality and sanity. I told her the HOA held elections in her absence. Her face tightened. The air around her seemed to thicken like humidity before a storm. She asked who won, but she phrased it like a threat. I said the new president was me. She didn't shout. She didn't faint. She didn't break the clipboard over her knee, though her grip tightened like she might. She simply stopped moving. A full system freeze, like her brain needed to reboot after hearing a sentence she could not emotionally process. I could almost see the calculation behind her eyes. 4 years, she had controlled this neighborhood with a mix of fear, manipulation, and nonsensical rulemaking. She believed she had carved her name into the foundation of every driveway. Now her power belonged to someone she considered beneath her. Someone she dismissed as too quiet, too agreeable, too patient. She finally whispered that she would challenge the election. I told her she could, as long as she followed the current rules. She hated that phrase. Current rules. Rules she didn't write. Rules that applied to her. She muttered something about how the neighborhood had fallen apart without her leadership. I gestured around us at the clean streets, the repaired lights, the absence of screaming residents. She refused to acknowledge any of it. People like her never see the world as it is, only as it fails to meet the standards they imagine for themselves. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, she walked away with the heavy, aggressive determination of someone planning a comeback no one asked for. I watched her disappear into her house, the door slamming with enough force to shake its frame. And for the first time that day, a shiver crawled up my spine. Not because she was dangerous in any dramatic sense, but because Karen was the type who could transform her own humiliation into a crusade. And knowing her, she had already started planning how to reclaim control of a community that had moved on without her. I finished the day reminding myself to stay calm, stay strategic, and stay 3 steps ahead. People like Karen always return with a plan. And unfortunately for her, so did I. The next morning began with the kind of quiet that feels staged, like the neighborhood itself was waiting to see what Karen's first move would be. I stepped onto my porch with my coffee and scanned the cul-de-sac. Nothing. No shouting, no clipboard smacking against thighs, no neighbors fleeing indoors like startled wildlife. I almost allowed myself to believe she had slept off her fury and embraced a new life of staying in her home and bothering no one. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of her voice echo through the alley behind my house, sharp and clipped, like someone trying to perfect a speech before delivering it on a stage she believed she owned. I followed the sound and found her pacing near the HOA community board, where announcements were pinned. She had taped a handwritten flyer to the center, covering the official maintenance schedule. The flyer stated she was calling an emergency community meeting that evening to address the illegal hostile takeover of the HOA. The words were underlined aggressively, as if the pen had personally offended her. When she noticed me approaching, she squared her shoulders and crossed her arms in a way meant to communicate power, though the fact that the tape stuck to her sleeve ruined the effect. I told her she didn't have authority to schedule HOA meetings, especially not an emergency one. She replied that she didn't need permission because she was the rightful leader. I reminded her that a legal election took place. She countered by claiming the election was invalid because she hadn't been present to defend her seat. I pointed out that being incarcerated wasn't typically listed as a qualifying excuse. She glared at me like I'd mocked her personal tragedy. She insisted the meeting would proceed, and everyone would attend, because they respected her more than me. It was a bold assumption, considering half the neighborhood celebrated the day she was arrested by grilling steaks in the park she once tried to ban barbecue grills from. Still, I didn't argue further. When someone is determined to fall on their own sword, you don't offer cushioning. By noon, the flyer had been torn down by someone else, and Karen had replaced it 3 times. Each new version was written larger, darker, and with more exclamation points. I removed the fourth one myself. She watched from her window like a hawk with anger management issues. Within minutes she stomped across the street and demanded I stop censoring her. I explained patiently that announcements must be approved by the current board. She asked who was on the board. I told her. Me, Mrs. Johnny from the corner, a retired school principal named Harris, and a very patient new homeowner named Miles. She dismissed them as puppets. I thanked her for calling me a puppeteer, because that implied creativity I didn't possess. She did not laugh. Instead, she threatened to file a formal complaint with the state. This was the first twist of the day, though not the biggest one. I asked on what grounds she would file. She said she would consult her lawyer. I didn't ask how many lawyers enjoy being cold-called for imaginary emergencies. I simply told her to go ahead. The second twist arrived mid-afternoon. A delivery truck pulled into the cul-de-sac carrying a stack of heavy boxes labeled HOA property. Karen dashed out of her house barefoot, waving wildly for the driver to follow her. Curious, I watched as she directed the boxes into her garage with the pride of someone welcoming her thrown back from storage. When I approached and asked what she had ordered, she announced they were archival records she had compiled over her years as president. She had paid to store them off-site during her incarceration, and now she was reclaiming them. This confused me because the HOA records were always kept in a locked cabinet in the community center, not in some off-site bunker. When I questioned her, she claimed these were her personal copies of every complaint, citation, and violation she had ever issued. The idea of her storing thousands of papers documenting neighbors' lawn lengths and mailbox heights was unsettling but believable. She said she would use them tonight at the meeting to prove the community required her leadership. I told her again the meeting was not happening. She looked at me with the ferocity of someone imagining a world where she still had power to fine me for standing too close to her driveway. The third twist came from an unexpected direction. Around 4 o'clock, Harris knocked on my door holding his tablet. He told me a neighbor sent him a screenshot of a mass text message they had received from Karen. Somehow she had either found or reconstructed an old HOA distribution list. The message accused me of financial misconduct, mismanagement of funds, and orchestrating her arrest to seize control. It urged everyone to gather at her house at 7:4 the truth. I read the message twice, partly because it was absurd and partly because she had spelled my name wrong, which somehow annoyed me more than the accusations. Harris asked what we should do. I told him we would do nothing. People tend to see through desperation when it's loud enough. He agreed, though reluctantly, knowing that doing nothing often provides the most dramatic effect. At 6:30, I stepped onto my porch and listened. Doors were closing. Car engines starting. Voices carrying through the neighborhood with curiosity rather than urgency. People were gathering. I walked down the street slowly, noticing expressions of mild amusement more than concern. When I reached Karen's driveway, I found nearly 20 residents standing outside while she stood on her porch surrounded by the stacks of boxes, which she had arranged like a paper fortress. She held a binder overhead like it was a sacred text. When she saw me, she ordered the crowd to remain calm, as if anyone here was on the verge of rioting. I stood at the edge of the driveway, letting the scene unfold without interruption. Karen began with a speech about how the neighborhood had spiraled into chaos without her. She pointed at the repaired park bench as an example of something she claimed would have been unnecessary if people followed her rules. The logic didn't hold, but she seemed proud of it. She then opened one of the boxes and threw handfuls of papers into the air, letting them flutter down like bureaucratic confetti. These, she declared, were proof of the community's incompetence before she took charge years ago. Several neighbors bent down and picked up the papers, only to discover they were ancient complaints about issues that hadn't existed in a decade. One sheet accused a resident of having a garden gnome that was too whimsical. Another cited a mailbox for being painted an emotionally aggressive shade of red. Laughter spread through the crowd. Karen mistook it for agreement and doubled down. She claimed these documents proved her right to immediately retake control. She pointed at me and announced that I was illegally occupying her position, mismanaging funds, and conspiring with the board to silence her. I let the silence hang long enough to earn everyone's attention. Then I calmly explained that the HOA had been audited twice since the new board took over and had passed everything. I reminded the crowd of Karen's arrest, trial, and conviction, none of which involved me beyond turning over her own documents. I didn't embellish. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse her of anything beyond what was already public record. The crowd shifted uncomfortably as reality clashed with Karen's performance. She shouted that I was lying. She tried to rally them, telling them I planned to raise fees and destroy their property values. I simply pointed out that fees had actually dropped since she left. Several residents nodded. She sputtered, losing her rhythm. And then the big twist arrived. Miles, the new homeowner and newest board member, stepped forward. He said Karen had called him earlier demanding he sign a petition she drafted to dissolve the board entirely. When he refused, she threatened to report him for keeping his trash cans too close to the curb, even though that was not a rule anymore. He pulled out his phone and played a recording of her voicemail. The crowd listened as her voice, sharp and frantic, laid out her ultimatum. The silence afterward was icy. Karen froze again, her eyes darting between the residents who had once feared her and the board she could no longer intimidate. Something in her posture collapsed. She tried to speak but failed. I didn't gloat. I just reminded her the world had changed during her absence. The HOA no longer revolved around her. Whether she liked it or not, her reign was over. When the crowd dispersed, she stood alone in her driveway, surrounded by relics of a power she no longer possessed. And as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't done. People like Karen never accept reality on the first attempt. Tonight was only the second twist. The biggest ones were still coming. Waving several sheets of paper in the air like a magician revealing rabbit, I took the papers from her and quickly realized they were not from our record. They were photocopies of her own old spreadsheets, the ones that got her arrested. She had inserted them into the cabinet, then broken the lock to pretend she found them. It was a sloppy plan, even for her. I explained to her, and the guards, who had followed her, that she had just committed breaking and entering, tampering with HOA property, and attempting to fabricate evidence. Her face flushed with the sort of panic people feel when they realize their brilliant plan is actually terrible. But then something shifted in her expression. A desperate resolve. She declared that she had been forced to break in because the board was hiding records from her. She tried to convince the guards she was preserving community integrity. They remained silent, no longer wanting any part of this narrative. Then came the big twist of the chapter. One of the guards, the same polite one from earlier, stepped forward and asked if Karen had mentioned her legal restrictions. I asked what he meant. He explained that as part of her release conditions, she was barred from holding any fiduciary position involving community funds. She was also required to avoid positions of administrative authority in organizations she previously mismanaged. Essentially, she was legally forbidden from participating in any HOA leadership role whatsoever. And she knew it. That was the most stunning revelation of the day. Everything she'd done since she returned, claiming authority, calling meetings, sending accusations, had violated the conditions of her release. Karen froze. Not dramatically. Not theatrically. Just stopped. Like a machine hitting a critical error. Her mouth opened, then closed again when she realized there was no lie that could skate around the officer's statement. She was caught in a trap she had accidentally built for herself. I didn't gloat. I didn't even speak. I simply watched as the guard informed her they were obligated to notify her parole officer. She backed away slowly, then turned and fled from the community center, nearly tripping over her own boxes of archival evidence. The guards followed at a distance. The board stood in stunned silence. None of us expected the fight to shift from neighborhood politics to legal consequences again. But Karen, being Karen, was incapable of understanding limits until they crushed her directly. As I walked home, I knew she wasn't finished. People like her never yield, they just regroup. And whatever she was planning next, it was going to be desperate. By the next morning, the HOA meeting fiasco had already settled into neighborhood gossip, the kind people joked about while weeding their flower beds or hovering over mailboxes pretending to check letters they didn't actually care about. I expected Karen to retreat temporarily, lick her wounds, and brainstorm dramatic comebacks involving more binders and handwritten flyers. Instead, she escalated in a direction I hadn't predicted. When I stepped outside, a white SUV was parked in front of her house. The logo on its door made my stomach sink. A private security firm. Not the kind you hire for big events or shopping malls. This one specialized in residential compliance enforcement. I had seen their advertisements years ago, back when Karen tried hiring them to patrol the neighborhood before the board shut her down for suggesting armed oversight of mailbox placement. Yet here they were, unloading equipment cases onto her driveway. I walked over calmly, because calmness unsettles people who thrive on chaos. The lead guard, a polite man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, explained they had been contracted by her personally. He assured me they were not here in an official HOA capacity. I asked what, exactly, they were supposed to enforce. He didn't know. Karen emerged from her garage with a spiral notebook and told him loudly she wanted them to perform daily compliance walkthroughs. The guard's face shifted from neutral to deeply confused. He asked if she meant they should check her property. She told him no, she meant the entire neighborhood. I stepped in and clarified that the HOA had not authorized any of this, that she had no legal authority to deploy compliance officers, and that if they attempted to enforce anything outside her property, they would be trespassing. The guard paused, nodded, and told me they would only follow lawful instructions. Karen snapped at him not to listen to me because I was the illegitimate president. He sighed with the long-suffering fatigue of someone realizing they had been hired into the world's most unhinged neighborhood soap opera. Word spread instantly. By noon, residents peeked from windows like meerkats nervous about predators. Kids stopped riding bikes. A couple postponed their dog walk. Even the retired men who normally sat outside drinking tea retreated indoors. Nobody knew what Karen's plan was, which unnerved them more than the security guards themselves. I decided to be proactive and called an emergency board meeting. When the four of us gathered in Harris's living room, I laid out the situation. Miles was furious that she was trying to create an atmosphere of intimidation. Harris was calm but concerned. Mrs. Johnny, who rarely got angry at anything except late mail deliveries, was outraged in a quiet way that felt scarier than shouting. We unanimously agreed that outside enforcement agents were not allowed to act under any HOA justification unless the board contracted them. Since we hadn't, they were powerless beyond Karen's own property line. We drafted a notice reminding residents that only HOA-approved personnel could enforce neighborhood rules. We taped it to the community board and emailed it to everyone. Within an hour, the guards had read it. They knocked on my door and apologized, explaining they would not conduct any neighborhood walkthrough. They would only assist Karen within her own home for personal safety, which somehow concerned me more than the original plan. When I asked what she had told them, they said she claimed people were sabotaging her property. Sabotaging. That was new, even for her imagination. That afternoon I learned what she meant. I found her kneeling in her front yard, inspecting a tiny patch of grass with the intensity of a detective examining a crime scene. She pointed at a single yellowing blade and accused me of poisoning her lawn. I told her grass sometimes dies. She said hers never did before the coup. I suggested watering it. She accused me of mocking her suffering. She then ordered the guards to document the damage. They looked at the blade of grass, exchanged weary glances, and took a polite photo because they were clearly paid enough to tolerate anything for a few days. The next twist arrived with the evening breeze. A group of neighbors approached me in my driveway, whispering like conspirators. One of them handed me her phone. Karen had been sending private messages to several residents, claiming the board had hidden financial mismanagement for months. She said she had proof stored in her boxes and would reveal it soon. She also claimed we were planning to raise HOA dues dramatically. People were worried, but hesitant to confront her because of the guards. I reassured them the finances were clean. They believed me, but fear spreads faster than reassurance. That night, I couldn't shake the sense that she was building towards something bigger. I reviewed the HOA financial reports again, not because I doubted my own oversight, but because defending the truth is easier when you know every detail. Everything was balanced. Repairs were logged. Payments recorded. There was no angle for her, unless she created one. The next morning proved that she had indeed begun manufacturing her own evidence. I woke to pounding on my door. It was Miles, panicked. He told me I needed to come to the community center immediately. When I arrived, I found Karen standing in front of the locked filing cabinet, holding a crowbar. The cabinet latch was bent, the lock half torn off. Scattered around her feet were HOA documents she had yanked out. Harris stood nearby, horrified. She announced triumphantly that she had discovered proof of embezzlement. For a brief moment, the neighborhood felt suspended in the kind of uneasy quiet that follows a near disaster. Everyone knew the guards had contacted Karen's parole officer. Everyone knew she had violated conditions she absolutely understood. And still, instead of accepting the consequences, Karen reacted with the frantic ingenuity of someone trying to outrun a tidal wave by jogging. By evening, her frantic attempts manifested in the strangest way yet. As I stepped outside to bring in a package, I noticed an unfamiliar sedan parked at her curb. A man in a suit stood on her porch, clipboard in hand. My first thought was parole officer. But the suit was too polished, too theatrical. When he handed her a folder, I realized this wasn't law enforcement. This was worse. He was a self-styled community consultant, one of those people who offered overpriced strategic guidance for neighborhood associations. Karen had hired someone to help her figure out how to regain power in a system she wasn't legally allowed to be part of. I couldn't hear every word, but I could catch enough of their conversation to know she was presenting her version of events, lies layered on denials wrapped in paranoia. She pointed at various houses, gesturing like she was giving him a map of enemy fortifications. He scribbled notes with the enthusiasm of someone being paid far too much. After 20 minutes, he left with a briefcase full of papers, and Karen marched back inside with the triumphant posture of someone who believed she had just secured reinforcements. I had no idea what she planned next, but any plan involving consultants and delusions of authority was guaranteed to be messy. The next morning brought the fourth major twist in her ongoing descent. A large folding table appeared in her driveway, covered in trifold presentation boards. On them were graphs, charts, and lists of grievances that looked like they had been assembled by someone in the middle of a caffeine-fueled meltdown. She stood behind it like a vendor at a farmer's market, except instead of selling vegetables, she was selling chaos. She waved at neighbors as they walked by, inviting them to approach. Most ignored her. A few stopped out of morbid curiosity. She tried explaining how the neighborhood was at risk of financial collapse, environmental collapse, cultural collapse, basically every collapse she could imagine. Her logic was so incoherent that even the politely curious retreated quickly. She didn't care. The presentation wasn't about persuading anyone. It was about proving to herself that she was still relevant. Around noon, I received an unexpected email from the consulting firm she hired. They were requesting all HOA leadership materials, documents, strategic plans, and budget allocations for review. The audacity was almost impressive. I replied that the HOA was not working with any consultants and that sharing documents with them would violate privacy rules. Within minutes, I heard anger erupt across the street. Karen had received a copy of my response. She stood in her driveway screaming into her phone, accusing the firm of incompetence for failing to override me. They didn't respond, at least not in a way she liked, because she threw her phone into her recycling bin and stormed inside. The consultant never returned. But that wasn't the last surprise of the day. As evening settled into long shadows and porch lights flicked on, a city vehicle rolled into the cul-de-sac. The logo was clear: Municipal Code Enforcement. My heart dropped. Someone had filed complaints. And given her behavior, I didn't need to wonder who. The officer stepped out and politely asked for me by name. He explained they had received multiple anonymous reports alleging that I was violating housing codes, misusing HOA funds for personal renovations, and altering drainage systems. I nearly laughed. Not because the accusations were funny, but because they were so obviously Karen's handiwork. I provided access to my backyard, garage, and side gate. He inspected everything with the calm professionalism of someone used to exaggerated claims. Unsurprisingly, he found nothing. As he left, he apologized for the inconvenience. I told him he wasn't the problem. Minutes later, the officer crossed the street to speak with her. She opened the door with self-righteous confidence that lasted about 3 seconds before dissolving into panicked over-explaining. I couldn't hear her words, but I could read the frantic pacing, the overly animated gestures, the way she kept pointing in my direction. The officer remained polite, nodding with the detached patience of someone who had dealt with far more intense residents. Eventually he walked away. She slammed the door so violently the decorative wreath fell off. I had barely stepped back inside when my phone buzzed. It was Harris. He said something was happening at the community center, and that I needed to come immediately. When I arrived, I found the door wide open, lights blazing, and Karen inside with a stack of papers spread across the meeting table. She had broken in again, this time by removing one of the window screens and crawling through. The guards had refused to help her and had actually texted me a warning before leaving for good. She looked up at me, wild-eyed but strangely determined. She announced she had filed a petition with the city to dissolve the HOA entirely. This time, she said it with a level of conviction that made it clear she believed she had found her new path to victory. I asked how she intended to dissolve an HOA she wasn't legally allowed to administer and one that had significant homeowner support. She triumphantly waved a stack of signatures. She claimed they were from residents demanding the HOA be dismantled. I took the papers. Half the signatures were from people who didn't live in the neighborhood. 3 were illegible scribbles. 1 belonged to a neighbor who had moved out 5 years earlier, and at least 2 signatures were clearly written in Karen's handwriting. I pointed this out. She immediately declared she had gathered them under verbal authorization from those residents. When I reminded her forgery wasn't covered by verbal permission, she snapped that I was sabotaging her efforts to restore order. I asked her what her end goal was. She hesitated longer than I expected, as though she hadn't actually considered the logistics of what she was doing. Finally she said the neighborhood had fallen into moral decay without her leadership and that the only way to repair it was to start from scratch. In her mind, removing the HOA entirely would create chaos, and chaos would prove she was needed. It wasn't about power, not exactly. It was about relevance. Karen needed to be essential. Losing authority had carved a hole in her identity she couldn't fill with normal life. She needed a structure to dominate, even if she had to burn down the existing one first. As we stood in the middle of the community center, surrounded by scattered papers and broken screens, I realized she was spiraling into a kind of desperation I hadn't anticipated. And desperation creates dangerous creativity. Then came the big twist. Harris walked in holding his phone, pale and speechless. He said the city had just emailed us. They had received a request, filed under Karen's name, to reclassify the entire neighborhood as a special administrative zone. The request claimed the HOA had fallen into disrepair and needed emergency intervention, with her listed as acting overseer until the city completed an evaluation. She had attempted to circumvent us entirely by appealing to the municipal bureaucracy. I wanted to be shocked, but the move was almost consistent with her escalating delusions. The problem, however, was that the city didn't know she was legally barred from community leadership. They had accepted the request for review. Karen smiled with genuine satisfaction, believing she had finally outplayed me. She stood straighter, the confidence returning to her posture like she was slipping back into her old skin. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that the city's review automatically involved a background check, and her conviction, along with her parole restrictions, would collide with the request she had just sent. Hard. As she walked past us, triumphant, Harris whispered the same thought that had struck me the moment I saw the email. This wasn't just spiraling anymore. This was the point where everything would blow up. I woke the next morning expecting fallout, but not the kind that actually arrived. I thought the city would call me first, requesting clarification about the special administrative zone nonsense. Instead, I opened my door to find a city vehicle parked in front of my house again. This time, the person approaching wasn't code enforcement or a clerk. He introduced himself as an investigator assigned to evaluate Karen's request. His demeanor was polite, almost weary, like he suspected he was walking into a circus but had to follow protocol anyway. He asked if I had time to discuss the HOA's structure, recent events, and any concerns I wished to officially document. The moment he said recent events, I could tell he already knew this wasn't going to be simple. I invited him inside and laid everything out. Not with dramatics or embellishments, just the factual timeline. Karen's return from jail, her attempted takeover, the unauthorized meeting, the fabricated evidence, the security guards, the break-ins, the petition with forged signatures, the false city complaint. I handed him printed copies of our board minutes, budget audits, and correspondence. While he reviewed the documents, I watched his expression shift from neutral to incredulous to resigned acceptance. When he finished, he thanked me for the transparency and said he would need to speak with her directly. I wished him luck. He chuckled nervously, which told me he had already read enough emails from her to be afraid. Things escalated faster than even I expected. Less than an hour later, I heard shouting from across the street. I stepped outside just in time to see Karen arguing with the investigator on her front lawn. She waved her arms like she was summoning an army, nervously pacing between invented talking points and emotional attacks. She accused him of conspiring with the HOA board, insisted the neighborhood was on the brink of collapse, and dramatically pointed at houses whose owners weren't even awake yet. The investigator tried to steer the conversation back toward facts, but she steamrolled him with increasingly unhinged accusations. At one point she claimed the entire board was laundering money through landscaping services. Then she claimed the park bench held evidence. He remained polite, but the confusion and exhaustion were visible. After 20 minutes, he thanked her and stepped away. She called after him, saying he was part of the corruption. He didn't respond. He practically jogged back to his car. By midday, rumors spread that the investigator had already contacted the city's legal department. Residents peeked from windows, waiting for news like we were living in a televised drama. Many of them gathered near the community board, exchanging updates, each one half-whispered as if speaking too loudly might somehow summon Karen. I walked over and answered what questions I could. People were tired of her disruptions, tired of the fear she tried to instill, tired of tiptoeing around someone who believed chaos was a leadership tool. One neighbor admitted he hadn't slept well in days because he expected her to accuse him of sabotage next. Another said his kids were scared to ride bikes past her house after watching her scream about lawns being poisoned. That hit me harder than anything else. Karen's antics weren't just annoying anymore. They were corrosive. Around 3 o'clock, the guard who had reported her parole violation returned to the cul-de-sac in a personal vehicle. He approached me quietly. He said he wasn't officially on duty, but he thought I should know her parole officer had reviewed the report. The officer planned to come by the next morning. The visit was described as mandatory and non-negotiable. The guard didn't say more, but the implication was clear. Karen was in serious trouble. I thanked him. He nodded and left quickly, as though afraid she would spot him and interpret his presence as another conspiracy. As evening settled in, I expected her to retreat inside and prepare her excuses for the upcoming visit. But Karen had an entirely different plan. As the sky darkened, she emerged from her house rolling a dolly carrying speakers. Not small speakers, full-blown event speakers. She set them up in her driveway and connected them to a microphone. Within minutes, her voice boomed through the neighborhood like a malfunctioning public announcement system. She declared she was holding an emergency address to the community because the city investigation was compromised. Neighbors stepped outside, not by choice, but because the noise was impossible to ignore. I stood at the edge of my lawn, watching her shout into the microphone as though volume alone could make her claims true. She ranted about the HOA's secret dictatorship. She said the investigator was biased. She claimed she had documents proving intentional community destabilization, which was just her latest phrase for the same nonsense she'd been pushing for days. She accused multiple neighbors of participating in a coordinated smear campaign, names chosen seemingly at random. People exchanged glances, some amused, others uncomfortable. But then her speech took a turn I hadn't anticipated. She announced she would be filing a restraining order against me, the board, and anyone she felt was part of the resistance. She threatened legal action, police intervention, and civil penalties, none of which she had the authority or grounds to pursue. But she kept shouting, increasing the volume as though sheer intensity would intimidate us into compliance. And then came the 5th chapter's massive twist. As she continued her tirade, 2 city vehicles pulled into the cul-de-sac. Not code enforcement. Not investigators. These were from the city attorney's office. 3 officials stepped out. They approached her calmly but firmly and asked her to shut off the microphone. She refused. They repeated the request. She refused again, louder. So they reached over and unplugged the speaker system themselves. Her shock was instant. She sputtered, pointing at them like their existence alone was a crime. She demanded to know why they were interfering with her community leadership duties. One official stepped forward and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. Her request to reclassify the neighborhood as a special administrative zone was denied immediately. Her petition was deemed fraudulent. Her signatures were invalid. Her claims were unfounded, unsupported, and, in several cases, false statements submitted to a government office. Worst of all, she had violated parole by attempting to assume an administrative role, exactly as the security guard had explained. The officials told her she would need to present herself for a further compliance review within 24 hours. Karen reacted like a cornered animal. She argued, denied, accused, insisted, and even attempted to blame her consultant. She tried to say the board coerced her into filing the request. She tried to say the city investigator misunderstood her. But the officials didn't budge. When they left, the cul-de-sac fell into a strange, heavy silence. Karen stood in her driveway, microphone still in her hand though it was no longer connected to anything. Her face wasn't angry anymore. It wasn't defiant or smug or performatively offended. It was terrified. Not of consequences, not really. Karen feared irrelevance more than punishment. Now both were approaching her at full speed. She went inside without another word. The rest of the evening passed quietly. Too quietly. That calmness, the kind that comes right before the biggest storm, settled into my bones. I knew she wasn't done. She had one last move left. Something reckless. Something desperate. something far bigger than forged signatures or speaker systems. And for the first time since her return, I felt genuinely uneasy. Because desperate people don't think about legalities or consequences. They think about impact. And Karen was running out of ways to make an impact without setting the entire neighborhood on fire, metaphorically or otherwise. Tomorrow, her parole officer would arrive. Tomorrow, everything would break open. And tomorrow, I had the sinking feeling she would try something unforgivable.